Good evening. Are we ready to begin? I'm glad you're all here. My name is Carrie Woodruff, which has been a name change. Previously in all my webinars I've been Carrie White, so just so you know, same person, just a different name. Okay, for tonight's event, we do have captioning and interpreters. Windows for the speaker interpreters can be closed or sized to create your personal viewing environment. If you'd like to enlarge the video window, click on the side of the window and drag it out to make it bigger. If you're going to utilize the interpreters, you may need to enlarge the window for the interpreters, which may interfere with the ability to see the PowerPoint. Therefore, if you've not already printed the PowerPoint, you can access it under the Attendees Materials link or access it through the attachment of the email that I sent you earlier today. The captioning will appear at the bottom of the screen. If you have technical issues, please refer to the help websites or the phone number that I sent by email, or use the chat function for tech support, and a Marie staff member will try to assist you. Questions for the presenter will be in the chat function. Please write down your questions and then wait for the presenters to ask for your questions, then type them into the chat box, and then they will answer it at the time that they've allotted during the presentation. And please wait to the end of the webinar and I will explain the CEU process. It will only take a few minutes, so please hold on after the webinar is concluded and I'll explain the process then. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer and Trenton, and I really appreciate you being here tonight.
Oh, I see the PowerPoint. All right. Hello, everyone. This is a fairly new experience for me. I'm less familiar with webinar technology, so please bear with us, but we're looking forward to spending a great evening with you. I think you can proceed to the next slide. Again, it's somewhat awkward to administer this remotely, and ask Carrie to proceed on to the next slide. My name, as you can see, is Trenton Marsh. I'm a certified deaf interpreter and have been since approximately 2005 or 2006. I was working as a freelance interpreter for some time. And then 6 years ago, I took a full-time staff interpreter position here at the Sanderson Community Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing in Salt Lake City, Utah. This was a new position to the staff here, and I was very lucky to allow me more opportunities to work, both in rehab settings as well as a number of other state-related settings. I've been able to take on different interpreting roles and different interpreting work, and that led me to being able to work with Jennifer to bring this workshop to you, bring some of the experiences and knowledge that we have gathered to share with you. Jennifer?
Hello, I'm Jennifer Storrer, and I work with Trenton in the same location, the Sanderson Community Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. That particular agency has a relationship with the Utah State Office of Rehab, and so we've worked together with them. And as I'm one of the staff interpreters, one of the hearing staff interpreters, and Trenton is a full-time staff interpreter as a CDI. So here at the center and across the state for all voc rehab services. So that's our parent agency that we work very closely with. We set up times to work with clients and counselors, and so we have more experience in the field of voc rehab than some of the others would have. And I'm a hearing interpreter. My parents are deaf. I've worked here at the Sorensen Center for 11 years, Sanderson Center. So I have worked in a variety of different areas, and I'm hoping you'll enjoy the webinar this evening and get a true benefit from our presentation.
So that's who we are. Carrie, next slide, please. I'll give you all just a moment to peruse this slide. As you can see, these are settings in which we've seen the need for certified deaf interpreter, and they vary and they are vast in terms of number. When it comes to vocational rehabilitation, specifically, oftentimes, a client is there to seek future employment. That can look like a number of different things. It may be on-the-job training or training to acquire a job. Maybe an academic route that they're taking to pursue employment. Maybe technical training that they're seeking. And so it can look like any number of settings or venues in which deaf people come into contact with voc rehab services. They may have just graduated high school and are trying to get a clear sense through their vocational rehabilitation counselor of what's next for them. It may be that they've been laid off due to poor economy and they need to sort of retrain themselves to get back into the workforce or pursue training in a slightly different field or just assistance with their job search. These are the types of settings in which deaf people come into contact with voc rehab most commonly. During this presentation, I'll talk about a number of different roles and how things can be physically arranged to ensure that interpreting is done successfully, whether the CDI is working with the voc rehab counselor, whether they're hearing or deaf, or with the hearing interpreter team. Depending upon their caseload, you may work as a CDI directly with a hearing or deaf vocational rehabilitation counselor. To give you a sense of what settings for CDIs look like that are perhaps atypical from what you've seen in terms of conference interpreting and places where you've seen CDIs being used, the role that we play in vocational rehabilitation may be additional and give you a better idea of the variety, the greater variety in voc rehab than other settings that you've seen CDIs work within. Jennifer, would you add anything to that?
I just thought I might summarize on some of your points. The CDIs that we tend to have involved with our settings prior to graduating from high school are transitional students. And so we do the post-evaluation and determining what types of training they would need to get a job before, and then also training that's done prior to their being hired in different types of jobs. We have a variety of trainings with job coaches and other types of settings. When we don't always have one person working with a client all the way through their efforts, but in those types of settings, we will call in a CDI, other times we will not, or sometimes the CDI will be involved with the entire process from beginning to end. And it's not just looking for employment, but there's all types of other areas that they are involved.
And if we view or recognize CDIs as one of the many resources that voc rehab can call upon or utilize to put in place to assist clients, once we recognize that, the job specialist or job coach now who's training a client on interview skills, let's say. We can provide a language model in terms of how to answer specific questions or the meaning behind certain typical interview questions. It will allow deaf clients to understand how to sign certain things and how to incorporate some of that into their future job search endeavors and interviews that they seek. So CDIs are simply one of the many resources for clients. And we'll show through a couple of different slides the perspectives in terms of when to call a CDI into a situation and when a situation may not require a CDI. And I think we'll get a better sense of how to make those decisions according to that information that's shared in those slides. Next. So we wanted to draw upon some videos that have been taken from the NCIEC pool of videos. They've developed 6 or 7 DVDs of interpreters working in vocational rehabilitation settings. Maybe a meeting with a counselor or in an assessment or evaluation, about a job search, and what interpreting for those clients may look like. They were able to video some vignettes about those clients' experiences growing up and how a CDI might work within those settings. So we are going to share the link through the chat function. You can click on that video, watch it, view it yourself, and then we'll discuss each video. But before we do that, the videos clips are not lengthy. And they show, this one in particular shows what I would call a traditional deaf and hearing interpreter team setup. There are 4 interlocutors involved, a hearing person and a deaf person, a student in particular, with a deaf and hearing team of interpreters working, the hearing interpreter standing and the deaf interpreter sitting. This will give you an idea of what a traditional setting utilizing a CTI may look like. We'll talk then about different terminology that comes into play. This is just to give you a visual through which to contextualize our discussion through the webinar. I also wanted you to, as you're watching this clip, keep in mind and take notes of anything that you notice as extraordinary, something that was a benefit to the situation or something that you weren't certain of, why a certain technique was used. Notice how the hearing and deaf interpreter team are working in tandem and what that interpreting process looks like. You may also see in this clip how the deaf client and the CDI communication happens, what that looks like. And I'll be curious to know what in particular you notice. So watch for some of those items as well as anything, Jennifer, you might add.
Yes, I would. The hearing counselor in these vignettes is meeting with the deaf consumer to establish goals for what they would like to work on in the future. And so for your assistance, we have captioning provided so that you can hear and see everything that is being said and also the signed portions. You hearing participants could listen to the sound if you'd like to do that. You could hear what is spoken, but there's also the captioning and the feeding that's being done from the hearing interpreter to the deaf interpreter and process between the two. And so you'll see that interpretation and have a variety of ways to get information. So we'd like you to just watch all the persons involved and see what it is that you would like to determine for yourself to expect. So you can click on the link and you'll find that link number 9 under materials. So if you look in that list of materials, you can click on the link, or we can also put them out there right now in the chat box. So there's the link provided for you in the chat box. So Trenton, did you want them to go ahead and view those right now? So yes, please go ahead and link on that, look at it, and then return to the group. if you would, if you're having difficulty seeing the video clip, if you could perhaps enlarge the frame there.
And I saw a prior comment that mentioned someone was unable to load the video. They simply couldn't view it. I wonder if you try Mozilla or if you go directly through the link. If that would be better. Well, apparently some people may not have received a download of the entire video, but just a minute instead of 3.
There should have been, yeah, the 3 minutes.
Some other folks aren't able to view the video.
Working for me. Apparently most of you are able to view the video clip. So let's go ahead and start with our discussion. I want to wait just a few seconds so that we get everybody's attention back to the presentation here on the webinar. From the messages I'm receiving in the chat box, apparently most of you have been able to see the video clips. For those of you who were unable to do that, I apologize. But that means that there'll be some other clips later on in our presentation. Hopefully you'll be able to view those because we'll go through the same process. We might look through YouTube and make sure that works out more efficiently next time. So Trenton?
All right. And it's funny, actually there are 3 video clips, and we started with number 9. And
Jennifer too.
I'm going to get her. Should I get Terry?
Sure.
All right. Well, I tell you what, Carrie did warn us that the video may be a bit of a technical challenge for this webinar, and Jennifer and I were hoping to work through those glitches. I apologize that it's been an issue for some, but they aren't that critical to the content of our webinar in general. NCIEC has those available, and they're free resources to anyone. Those DVDs are free to take advantage of. this was just an opportunity for you to see what the CDI hearing interpreter team process may look like. We're going to go on to talk about the purpose and the application of what was on the video, the physical setup of space, so that you get a better sense of how that might take place. If you weren't able to view the video, you didn't miss something monumental. It'd be nice if you could have seen it, but not absolutely critical. So, did anyone want to share comments or questions in regard to what you were able to view, if you were able to view video clip number 9? It showed 4 individuals involved in the scenario. There was a young man who was talking with a book rehab counselor in clip number 9. Does anyone want to comment about that particular clip? Anything that you noticed or wondered about? Yeah, Jennifer?
I think we were both on the same page.
Right, it was the hearing interpreter that was standing behind the client, the deaf client, and the voc rehab counselor was sitting next to the CDI. The CDI was able to stay in the line of sight of the deaf client with the hearing interpreter behind the deaf client. You may be wondering why that physical setup is most amenable. First, simply visual lines of sight. The CDI can take feeds from the hearing interpreter, and it's not necessarily the case that the hearing interpreter must be behind the deaf client, but it can be less distracting for the deaf client. If they can see the hearing interpreter signing, it oftentimes is a bit visually distracting. Having the hearing interpreter behind the deaf client can be a benefit in terms of being less distracting. There are a number of different scenarios in which the hearing interpreter can be to the side or adjacent to the deaf client. So as the deaf client is producing a message, the hearing interpreter is able to see that as well. But these are a number of different considerations to keep in mind when you're talking about physical setup.
And Trenton, one question that has arisen is why you even have a CDI in that particular situation. We tend to get a CDI if the person really is a strong ASL visual learner. We want to make sure that we're accommodating for that. And also, if it's a young person, it might be a non-native language user. But those are the issues that are very important when you're establishing goals for the client to be working on in the immediate future. It's very critical to have a clear communication of those things. And so both rehab will establish the plan as a result of that interview process, and so those pieces are important. Those are the reasons I can see. And then what we've been noticing lately is that we think communication is happening just fine. And then once we have a CDI involved, we can discern that there are other factors that need to be conveyed, cultural issues that perhaps a hearing interpreter might have overlooked. So we are fortunate here at our center that we do have a full-time CDI who can come and make sure that those necessary accommodations to the needs of the client are made properly and greater information is gained.
You know, occasionally when we talk about a range of consumers and communication, language, bank of knowledge, it really is a range. When we talk about a high visual consumer, someone who uses more gestures and is less familiar with English vernacular, they aren't the only individuals who would benefit from a CDI, however. I've noticed that there can be a benefit throughout the range of consumers in terms of their language use. It could be simply the concept that's being conveyed or world experience that's different from the setting in which they find themselves. And I've noticed that, you know, I have a strong grasp on English, and that often helps in terms of making connections in a certain setting. And we'll go on to talk more about acculturation later on in our webinar, and that might help you get a better sense of what we're talking about when it comes to the needs of individual consumers for CDIs. Again, I think the larger purpose of this clip was to show you what we call the equal responsibility of each team member. If a hearing and deaf interpreter team are working together, they each are equally responsible for conveying a message that's understandable and that has fidelity to the deaf consumer. If there are other questions that you have, my guess is that we may be answering some of them in the subsequent slides that we share with you. Next slide, Carrie. Oh, I think go back one. I think you jumped one too far. Can you go back? Oh, actually one for, there we are. So here you see a list of the most common settings in which a CDI is warranted. These are the ones that we have been familiar with through our experience. One that isn't there, I think, is also age. Jennifer mentioned youth, oftentimes benefiting from the use of a CDI. And we've noticed that, in fact, juvenile deaf individuals really can benefit from having just the cultural rapport with another deaf person in the room, and that can often be a very strong benefit. It may not be about language or socio-emotional development, but it may be just about a young person's experience, not having enough experience in the world and a strong enough bank of knowledge in a particular setting that's acquired through socialization and exposure to environmental cues and incidental learning that takes place. And many young deaf people now may be mainstreamed and isolated in an educational setting. And therefore, their incidental learning really takes an impact. And when they come out of that familiar high school environment, you know, they're on their own, meeting with whomever it may be, a hearing professional or a vocal rehab counselor, and there are some information deficits that need to be relinked or need to be made explicit for them. Okay.
I had a thought to add to that comment. We see that it's also not just for the deaf client, but for the vocal rehab counselor. The deaf interpreter can share experiences, things that they can use to help assist in the process and make that go more smoothly. Oftentimes, the hearing interpreter doesn't have that knowledge base of what a deaf person might have experienced. So the deaf interpreter can definitely assist in making that an equal opportunity for both.
I think something else that's critical for us to consider is, you all as interpreters are aware of the benefits of having a team in general, whether it's two hearing people on a team or a hearing interpreter and a deaf interpreter or two deaf interpreters. There are benefits of simply having someone else there to share the responsibility of conveying a message, monitoring the message and the conveyance of the message. And I think that comes into play here with the CDI as well. The hearing counselor may be very unfamiliar with deaf individuals. Maybe they don't sign at all in any way, shape, or form, and it's just one deaf person on their caseload. So they have no awareness of the deaf experience. It may be they may not have resources to share with a deaf person. There are some colleges that have a great number of deaf students, others who have very few. And so a hearing interpreter can go so far in terms of making that link, but a deaf interpreter can really show a counselor how to work with a deaf student and share some of the experiences that they have gained as a deaf adult. And I think that covers the list that you see here. Carrie, next slide. The point of this slide is not always that a CDI does something entirely different than a hearing interpreter, but what we bring to the situation sometimes can make a vast difference, what we have to offer. If you're just talking about language and culture, certainly all interpreters work within the context of language and cultural mediation, and that defines our job, essentially. But what can CDIs bring to provide something slightly different. And this list goes into some of those items. I won't go in depth on each item, but as you look at these lists, you'll notice that there are quite a few items that CDIs can bring to a particular setting. One of the items mentioned is paralinguistic, a paralinguistic contribution. That's a term that comes from the demand control schema. And when a certain demand arises, it falls into 4 different categories: environmental, interpersonal, paralinguistic, or intrapersonal. And there may be a language demand, but there are some other paralinguistic influences that may become bothersome to the communication or cause a demand when it comes to the communication between individuals. Maybe cognitive functioning, could be something as simple as their sign pace or style. It could be a physical disability that comes into play, cerebral palsy. You know, to name just a few, it could be an individual who's deaf as well as blind. I could go on and on to the demands that come into play with communication that fall into that paralinguistic category. And CDIs are often able to catch what's needed and provide that information to the hearing interpreter and to convey a more rich, full message than a hearing interpreter struggling to try to just understand what the individual is saying and then try to interpret accurately. That's where having that team framework can be a real benefit. I take on the responsibility of assessing the message for meaning, and then we work together to convey that meaning in a manner that has a lot of fidelity. When we talk about, it's not a vocational rehabilitation example, but one example of a consumer, let's say, who is grief-stricken or very emotional, can require quite a bit of work in terms of just keeping communication going visually. One interpreter being able to take in a message and work with the demands of ensuring visual access for a consumer can be too great of a challenge. So that's one example in which having a CDI team member can really bring something beneficial. Jennifer, would you add something?
Well, I would like to add something about the visual aspects of the interpretation. For example, with a hearing interpreter, I often see one of the tremendous benefits for bringing in a deaf interpreter is that the deaf client then can see the message that's being given back to the hearing interpreter. They're able to view all of that and feel more assured that the message is being conveyed properly, clearly, if needed. If there were no deaf and hearing interpreter teams, then the deaf client has to rely on the fact that hopefully that the hearing interpreter is getting the complete message. It just adds another level of comfort and confidence in the message that's being conveyed when you have the deaf and hearing team, because you have that visual interpretation taking place and a greater access is provided to the deaf client.
I would say too, as deaf people, we know very well firsthand that when interpretation is taking place, I'm not certain that my thoughts are being interpreted accurately, and they may just be covering up miscommunication. And I'm always hoping that the interpretation is accurate, but oftentimes it's not, and it ends up taking more time to clarify what we mean. And there is a great deal of trust that's involved in interpreting, and rather than an interpreter interrupt me and have me repeat myself to make myself clear, than allowing misunderstandings to go unchecked or to create even worse misunderstandings. As a consumer, having that immediate access to the interpretation allows me to perhaps clarify something or to provide additional information that needs to be conveyed to the hearing person. And like you said, it comes back to trust, I think, as well as power. It allows a deaf person to be more involved in terms of their goal, in terms of what they're communicating, the terminology. And so I think there are just a lot of positive benefits to having a CDI involved and the unique contributions that they bring. The last item here mentions SIMCOM, or simultaneous communication. I think that's an important issue I can't emphasize enough. I watched one video and I watched it with Jennifer, and we thought it was very interesting. There was a point at which the deaf interpreter would begin having a dialogue, serving as in a function of simultaneous communication. Really, we're two different people talking between each other, and there can be some pardon me, the interpreter needed to ask for clarification. But the challenge with simultaneous communication is that one language takes precedence over the other. If a person is signing and speaking at the same time, obviously there's a detrimental impact to one of the two languages. But with two interpreters, you're able to provide that same function. On the videos, you're able to see examples of that, and I thought that was very interesting. That was to be able to share that responsibility through having a team member, whereas a hearing interpreter wouldn't be able to do that through coming alone. So shall we proceed to the next slide, Jennifer?
Yes. Go to the next slide, please, Carrie.
We're very fortunate that there has been some recent data collection by two individuals, Anna Witter-Merrithew, as well as Carla Mathers. And this is a large project that they've taken on with hours of video being looked at. This was just taken on by the NCIEC. And what they're looking at is, they've been looking at interpreters in the book rehab setting, and they have developed a number of different samples. Something else they're now beginning to look at is interpreters within the legal system, hearing and deaf teens, and they're gathering hours and hours of data of these teams working together. And this data is very new. It was shared during the ILI, or the Legal Interpreting Institute in Denver, Colorado, just less than a month ago.
Yes.
They do have a full article that they'll be presenting at the Conference of Interpreter Trainers conference in Portland, Oregon. And Anna, as well as Carla, will be presenting that there. So I won't go into great depth about what they're finding. But very cursorily, what they are finding provides a great deal of information, a better understanding of how CDIs function in a particular setting, that they really support the communication goals of both the hearing and deaf individuals involved. And in particular, one thing of note is that oftentimes a deaf interpreter will recognize that in terms of communication and turn-taking, something needs to be done, a strategy needs to be employed to provide more deaf interpreters are more actively involved in the interpretation process for the purpose of clarifying communication on either end. Their study is finding rather fascinating examples, and Jennifer has two or three examples of what CDIs are more prone to do than hearing interpreters.
So the data that has been collected has discovered that in studying a variety of deaf interpreters working with different deaf consumers, they found that with deaf children, as you just saw in that particular clip and with the other person in there, that there are a large number of these particular factors. They found that with deaf interpreters, they do a lot more checking in and making sure that the process and the flow of information is very clear, making sure that turn-taking is taking place appropriately and there is the proper discussion of waiting for turns so that we can make sure that one message has been completed before anything else is going on. So they're helping to organize the flow of the conversation. The deaf interpreters tend to do that more often, that checking in process and coordinating all that. The other aspect that they've discovered is that the deaf interpreter is checking to make sure that the messages are correct. When we're presenting that, the deaf interpreter is presenting that information to a hearing interpreter, they will check in to make sure that that is correct before they feed that information to the hearing interpreter. So again, it's that checking repeatedly to make sure that the information is conveyed properly, but also checking for clarification prior to beginning the actual interpretation. That deaf interpreters do that more frequently than do hearing interpreters. It's just something that they know instinctively, that it's not just that they're trying to take on a larger role in that sense, but making sure that everything is clear, that the message is correct, and so forth. The other thing that the hearing, it has to deal with the hearing and deaf consumers. Then there'll be more of what we would have typically been used to seeing as like ASL expansion, more native use of sign, in addition more context. You'll see that on another clip. For example, in one of those, the context was added. We call that framing, and that's the type of concept we're talking about, giving that additional information to help the deaf consumer be able to make those connections and get the entire picture of what's going on, and before you go on with proceeding with more information. And the deaf interpreter tends to do that much more often than does the hearing interpreter. So those are the types of aspects that this project has been able to discover, and I'm hoping that once this presentation is completed, that you don't think that deaf interpreters are only used for non-natives who aren't yet skilled in ASL or other things. So we tend to think of those as the typical situations that we would bring a CDI in, but we are finding a great many other areas that are finding to be very beneficial by adding the use of a CDI. So we just want to make a brief comment as to regards to the work that's being done right now. Oh, Trenton, I had one other thought. I think a good example of checking that the second issue is checking for accuracy and clarification. As you saw in the previous clip, Trenton, with they were talking with Tyler, the deaf student in the clip. He made a comment of struggling trying to write his own notes and attend the sign language interpreter. So Trenton reiterated what had been said and clarified that prior to feeding that to the hearing interpreter. So Trenton made that point of clarification before going ahead with the process. So that's one of those examples of that happening.
And I think, too, hearing people in general would think, well, just take advantage of note-taking services. They're familiar with that through, the Disability Resource Center. That they often provide note-taking services for deaf students. But the reason for needing note-taking services is not always obvious to hearing people. Tyler mentioned that it's hard for him. And they just said, well, you can receive that service. And I was validating him. As a deaf person, I know that it's typically not our strength to be able to take in information visually and take notes on our own. And, I know that that's the case. And I know that they also provide that note-taking service. And I made that, clear in the interpretation. I think that's something that, because I've had that shared experience, you're right, I know that it's a challenge, but I know that you can take advantage of a certain service, a note-taking service. And that's Voc Rehab's goal as well, to take advantage of the services that are available to a deaf student or deaf client. So I think that's something to also consider. I didn't necessarily realize at the time, but looking back at it, I realized that was taking place. I was validating, you're right, that is a difficult experience, and you're not alone there. But now what services are available for you to take advantage of, and making sure that he was linked up to those services. Jennifer, you also mentioned the data collection that is taking place. And they're utilizing a phrase that they're referring to as an interpreter-initiated utterance. So an interpreter-initiated utterance, where the interpreter will take in a certain amount of communication and will check in or seek clarification, and that often seems to be the case when CDIs are working. In another video clip, I'd like you to take a look at and notice that feature when the interpreter themselves initiates an utterance in the communication. It's not coming from either of the interlocutors or the consumers, but from the CDI themselves. That's something to keep in mind. I want to thank both Anna Witter-Merrithew and Carla Mathers for their assistance in helping us understand and frame what's taking place when CDIs are working with hearing interpreters in the interpreting profession.
You can also find the article after it's published during the Conference of Interpreter Trainers proceedings. And once you see that, you then could get in touch with CDIs, so you can see that if you're interested in perusing that article in more depth.
All right, next slide, please. So this term came up a few slides ago, but I saved a fuller explanation of it until now. Something that we've realized is very critical in terms of understanding how this process takes place. The first time that I gained an awareness of this word was through some research, shared research, through a publication called Signs. The author's name escapes me.
Anna Mindess?
That's right, Anna Mindess wrote a book entitled Signs. That's where that term first arose to my awareness. And I thought, what's the best way to show this visually when a CDI comes into play, and how a consumer can best benefit from a CDI working, or perhaps not benefit when a CDI is brought in. I sign acculturation in this way, something like cultural acquisition. And any time that people from two different cultures encounter each other, they go through a process of acculturation. Maybe language, or food, or distinct religious beliefs, music, you name it. All of those, they're going through a process of acculturation, and you don't become immediately appraised of the differences in those cultures. But through time, we do become acculturated to another culture if we're exposed to it for a long enough period of time. And obviously, that takes place when the hearing and deaf cultures interact. And I'd like to show a few charts that I developed that will allow you to perhaps get a better sense of what takes place when acculturation comes into play. Carrie, next slide. I'd like to throw out another term as well, that being communication gap. Communication gaps occur when there's not a shared language between two individuals. Or perhaps they share a language, but they have different worldviews that can cause a communication gap. For the purposes of this webinar, we're talking about a deaf individual and hearing people, one who uses a visual language, the other who uses an auditory spoken language. From this chart, you can see a hearing person on one end of the continuum represented by H, meaning they've been raised entirely in a hearing culture, they've had all the experiences that a typical hearing person may have. And D, on the other end of the continuum, would be a culturally deaf person who was raised using ASL natively, not necessarily from a deaf family, but early on had exposure to the deaf community, to deaf norms, perhaps went to a large residential program or a day program, and they're on the opposite end of the continuum. And those are represented by H and D. You see two arrows, however, beneath that continuum, and that represents the overlap that can take place in terms of acculturation. And there really isn't a communication gap between these particular individuals. It shows that they are able to effectively communicate. One example is, me working with an interpreter or with Jennifer. I'm deaf, she's hearing. We don't need the use of an interpreter because we have overlap in terms of acculturation. We've acculturated to each other's cultures sufficiently so that we have shared cultural knowledge. And so this is an example where we're benefiting from shared acculturation. However, oftentimes we see that that's not the case in the world at large. And I hope that the next slide, Carrie, let's look at that. We'll illustrate that. So we're looking at the same two ends of the continuum at the top, hearing individuals and deaf individuals. But now, with the arrows beneath that continuum, there is a gap. It may be that the deaf person is familiar enough with the world at large, and they have strong language skills. They're acculturated to the hearing person somewhat, but the hearing person is very, very new to deaf norms, deaf culture. It may be the first deaf person they've ever met, or it may be just that they've had brief encounters and they have perhaps misguided views through movies, through media of deaf individuals, but they do in fact have a communication gap, as you can see in this chart. And again, traditionally, what we do in terms of bridging that gap is to place a hearing interpreter between these two individuals. And you'll notice, this hearing interpreter is able to compensate for that gap. Now the hearing and deaf individuals no longer have a communication gap because the hearing interpreter is able to bridge that gap. But the hearing interpreter still comes from hearing cultural norms and a hearing cultural background. So pardon the pause for a technical glitch. The hearing interpreter and the hearing person can easily understand each other because they come from a shared cultural experience, a shared linguistic experience as well. But one question I often ask interpreters in general, or hearing individuals in general, is how often they meet a hearing person that they don't understand. How often is that something that they encounter? And most hearing people would say that's very rare. I understand most hearing people that I encounter, unless someone has a very strong foreign accent, or there's something cognitively happening, or a mental health issue that they may not understand what an individual is talking about. But that's very rare. It's a very small percentage of people that they meet. If you're born, in the American society, you're able to pick up, perhaps there are regional differences, but to a large extent, hearing individuals understand other hearing individuals. And that's true for deaf individuals as well. I rarely meet a deaf person that I don't understand. If, in fact, I don't understand them, I know that there's something very unique. Maybe they did just move from another country and have, or perhaps even no language at all. Maybe they grew up very isolated from any enculturation with the deaf community, but that's very rare. I commonly do understand deaf individuals that I encounter. So this graph shows that an interpreter, hearing interpreter with training and acculturation into the deaf culture can support or bridge that gap. And the information and knowledge that's needed to be shared between these two individuals. There are other situations that arise, however. If you'll go to the next slide, Carrie, this will illustrate that. This visual illustrates a scenario in which the deaf person may not be familiar with hearing norms and culture. Again, it could come back to age. Like Jennifer mentioned, a deaf young person who doesn't have a lot of exposure to and experience in the world. It may be just lack of acculturation into the hearing community, maybe age-related. Or it could be, in fact, that it's just a very visually oriented person that we're seeing more and more. Perhaps they've been isolated, or they've moved from another country in their upbringing. They're new to America, which means that they're not fluent in American Sign Language yet, or English at this point. They may have another language from their native country, but it's not the language that's predominant in America. So you'll notice that there's a larger communication gap where the hearing person is largely unacculturated to deaf culture and vice versa. Bringing in a hearing interpreter to this scenario, you'll see, however, does not bridge the gap that exists. The hearing interpreter's exposure with the language and culture of the deaf community may not be one that allows them to bridge that gap. It may not be something that they're familiar with. They've never seen anybody communicate like this person. It's an entirely new experience to them, and they're not able to bridge this communication gap. And this is one instance in which bringing a CDI in who has been acculturated to the language norms and typical hearing experience is able to bridge that gap for the deaf individual. I know this is a very superficial and simplistic visual, but I think it does give us a sense of the outlier that may exist, perhaps that comes from another country and does not know ASL whatsoever, or maybe even any sign communication, and that can be an even greater challenge. They would be obviously an outlier on this continuum, farther from the person more in the middle. We often see individuals who aren't outliers but are somewhere on this continuum, but a CDI can bring in the ability to bridge that communication gap and pull that person further on the continuum so that the communication gap is compensated for in any given scenario. So this illustrates acculturation, and I hope that gives you a better picture of how a CDI can benefit in those situations. Some person made a comment that they didn't get those particular slides because it's new information to them.
Yes, and we can send that link to the newer bunch of slides afterwards.
I think something else that we really want to emphasize that's critical in terms of acculturation is that it's, how shall I say this? This takes place on a number of different levels. There might be one scenario in which one person is very comfortable and very acculturated to a certain scenario. If a person has worked for a company for a number of years, maybe as a single deaf person and then otherwise entirely hearing workforce, I know the people, I know the vernacular, I know them well, and I might not even need an interpreter in that scenario. I navigate communication very easily. But if I were to move myself into another scenario where I'm in the emergency room for something traumatic, it's a new environment to me, it's new people, it's new terminology, it's new issues that come into play, and now my acculturation in that scenario, I would be almost at the outlier end of the continuum because I wouldn't know whatsoever what's happening. I'm very disconnected to that scenario, that environment. And now I would need an interpreter who's more familiar with that setting, whereas I wouldn't have needed one in my vocational setting. So that can often create a challenge for interpreters, and often then becomes the reason why we would bring in a certified deaf interpreter. I think this is a good way for us to think in terms of, that we can't think of in terms of always or never, but it's more of a continuum. Sometimes we just think, oh, that person doesn't need CDI, they'll always be okay in any given communication setting. Oh, pardon me. Sorry, my camera went to sleep. Or you can't necessarily say that a consumer always needs a CDI. We have to look at a person's acculturation in any given setting, and we don't just want to necessarily say across the board that there isn't movement on this continuum. There certainly is, based upon the setting that a given person finds themselves in, based on the information that's involved, based upon their emotional state in a given setting. Who my interpreter is, whether they're skilled or an experienced or whether they're a novice. There are a number of factors that need to be considered when we're thinking about providing or not providing a CDI.
And if I could add, especially in regards to voc rehab, what we have seen is that example of not always and not it's not always a never, but when you're having the psychological evaluation, oftentimes they will require that and provide an interpreter for that setting. And that's the situation where if someone's never been involved in the process with a CDI, they might want to do it in that particular situation, because there are many people who have never gone through a psychological evaluation, and also for the evaluator, they won't know that experience with a deaf client. So by having the CDI perhaps in that one setting but not in the others. So this also is something that comes up in the voc rehab setting.
Sure. Okay. I saw some comments that came into the chat function. I don't know, Jennifer, do you want to entertain those now or wait till the end?
Well, I was thinking perhaps you go ahead and proceed with your presentation, and we can look at that later.
I was just hoping that that chart would give you a better idea of what to look at. And when you encounter a certain client, thinking about how and when to request a CDI at a given assignment. Looking at what their acculturation is or knowledge is in a particular setting, and that might be fluid. So it might be a framework through which you can evaluate that. Next slide, please. All right. Well, this may be, again, a challenge. I know some people had a hard time viewing the previous video. But we wanted to start with video number 4. It's very brief. I think it only lasts about 2 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Video number 1, which we'll get to later, is a bit longer. But if you'll first watch video number 4, then we'll come back to the webinar for some discussion. Then we'll go on to view video link number 1. The same individuals are involved in both of those videos. It's not...
Yes, you're right. Those two are the same individuals.
Right. The first video showed different individuals being filmed. The next 2 clips will show the same individuals. Let's see. Do you know what to tell them to look for?
Well, the setting is that there's a vocational evaluator. That person can sign somewhat. There is no hearing interpreter involved, just the deaf interpreter and the deaf client and the hearing evaluator. Because the deaf interpreter was Trenton and is very familiar with the setting with that particular evaluator, was able to provide the interpretation without the use of a hearing interpreter. We call that communication support. We use that a great deal at our center, even for deaf people who sign really well, but they'll bring in the deaf interpreter to assist in clarification of communication between the 3 parties. So what you'll see here is a deaf interpreter without a hearing interpreter involved, so there won't be any feeding taking place in this setting.
Right. And we chose this clip for you to view because, again, this isn't something we typically think about in terms of a scenario involving a CDI. The counselor or evaluator may be deaf or hearing, but may think, oh, I sign good enough to just provide direct communication with the client. But again, it comes back to, interpreters in general. We bring communication skills to the setting. Whether someone can sign or speak, it doesn't mean that it's good enough for the communication that's taking place here. We need to utilize the skills of interpreters, whether it's deaf or hearing, to recognize the communication gaps that are taking place or what's not being communicated effectively, and how to alter our approaches to make communication take place more effectively. So this is one other great example of how to utilize a CDI, even if everyone in the room signs to some extent, to some degree. With video clip number 4, again, I'd like you to view that and then come back into the webinar to share some of what your thoughts or considerations are with this video. But I'd like you to take a look at it and look at how the interpreter is using the technique of framing linguistically, where and how you see that being utilized. In addition, I'd like you to look for different functions that the CDI is serving within, what behaviors they're performing, and how that has an impact upon the proceeding. I'd also like you to keep an eye out for the deaf person. They're on a small screen in the corner, and the interpreter and the evaluator are on a larger screen in the upper right corner. I know it will be difficult perhaps to track, but look at the deaf person's reaction and what they seem to be reacting to. I think that's something to be considering as we view this. Shall we go ahead? So go ahead and watch this video clip, and then let's all return to the webinar after viewing it.
It is provided in your chat box. Let me tell you something. Okay, we'll provide a few seconds here for people to come back to the webinar.
See some interesting comments. Right. So, what functions did you see the CDI employing? And what did you see in terms of the technique of framing in the video? Some of your comments are very interesting to me when it comes to this idea of giving examples of disabilities and pursuing that concept. Jennifer and I had some discussion about that as well. And I think because culturally deaf people don't always view themselves as disabled, that's a label that the government places upon us. It's like a game that we know we have to play. You know, we have to recognize that view, that understanding, and so I might have to label myself disabled to have access to services. That's a cultural challenge for deaf people at large. The deaf consumer, or the CDI, might not necessarily feel comfortable saying that, you know, that they have a disability. So you might want to check in. Do you see yourself associated with the group of disabled people in America? And if not, you know, you have to let the evaluator follow up at that point. Obviously, the evaluator knows that the person is deaf, and they may be documenting that, but they may want to get that directly from the person. So I think that's interesting as well. Just trying to check in about those types of issues, those identity issues. I also recall, you know, spelling disabled, and that obviously wasn't effective communication for that consumer. But I've seen, you know, some common signs like the sign DA, and a person may not be familiar with that sign. So letting the evaluator also realize where the consumer is at in terms of their understanding of that identity issue. And you might feel like it's just easier to say, oh, you know, you're deaf, that's your disability. But again, it comes back to that, you know, culturally deaf perspective versus disabled community or disabled person perspective. And I know there may be some questions that arise from this discussion.
And I think some of the comments that are being made are excellent regarding the CDI making checks for clarification, and that has some correlation to the data that's being collected. But you're talking about the goals that you're trying to establish, and the CDI is not trying to elicit the response that he expects, and is trying to respect the values of the deaf consumer. So they leave it up to the evaluator to follow up with further questions. So I see that several people said they didn't expect the CDI to fix the issue or continue to pursue the response that the evaluator was looking for.
And you notice that this evaluator working with this deaf person, I thought it was interesting that in some ways it added to the efficiency. Oftentimes we feel a need to clarify, but without a CDI involved in that situation, you can foresee what may have taken place. It would have been an enormous communication gap between those individuals. You know, they both might have been able to sign something very superficially, but in terms of cultural and background information, they came from very different places. And again, when you're looking at the need to evaluate someone, that's something to keep in mind, that communication gap.
The other thing to bring up is that the issue that Trenton brought up about framing and the looking into the context. When a person doesn't have the necessary context to be able to relate to those things, to fingerspell the word disability or disabled, Trenton had to provide the necessary context about the fact that in the voc rehab system there are people who only get services who are disabled, and trying to give the deaf consumer some context and then follow that up with a question. And that's a very good example of how you incorporate framing, providing some of that context. That's something that's predominantly done by deaf interpreters.
In terms of the acculturation chart that I showed you, maybe you recognize during this dialogue where there was some disconnect between those individuals. There were communication gaps. So I think it comes back again to the framing that we saw in that chart regarding acculturation. Again, resources are there, and one of those resources is a CDI for this type of scenario. Okay, I'm looking at time here. Boy, time has gone quickly.
Yes, it is. So maybe perhaps we shouldn't go on to the next clip.
Let's see. You're right. The second one was even longer than the most recent one.
I think we should go ahead and proceed.
You know, I just want to add one other. Yeah, I just wanted to throw in one more comment. And you can still watch the clip on your own after the webinar, but there was one other thought I wanted to add when it comes to the perspective of the deaf person. If you watched while the evaluator began the dialogue, he asked, you know, what is your disabling condition in this scenario? And that interpretation ensued. If you watch the deaf person's face, she didn't show, you know, any sort of questioning look or expression. Once the CDI, though, began signing their interpretation, mentioning, oh, you've been here before, and you know, what are you here to get? And you could see that there really was not much communication happening until the CDI began the interpretation. I think it's interesting to watch that facial expression again when it comes to a deaf person communicating to a deaf person. There's just a greater comfort level. And so she looked more engaged in the communication, clearly. The CDI has the ability to check in and ask for clarification and dialogue more richly with the deaf person. And so I think that's something that is not there when a person is not skilled in attempting to communicate with, you know, in this type of scenario with a deaf client. So I think we better move along in the interest of time. Yeah, next slide, please. So this slide goes into who determines when a CDI is warranted. Either, you know, a hearing or deaf person has the opportunity to call in a CDI, but who makes that determination? And I think, you know, Jennifer and I have talked about any number of scenarios, any number of people being able to make that request. It could be either consumer who requests a CDI, but most commonly, these are the individuals who would typically be aware of the need for a CDI. Again, it comes back to this idea of acculturation. In this particular setting, a CDI may be warranted, and any of these individuals might be able to make that determination. And again, it may just be lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, information of what a CDI is. Maybe they're unaware and not aware of their ability to use a CDI in a given setting. Next slide. Jennifer?
With the brief amount of time we have left, we want to talk about the hearing and deaf interpreter team and how we can make sure the process is as fluid as possible. Next slide. Here you see the differing roles that could be used, that are used by the deaf and hearing teams. And we won't go into great depth on all of those, but Trenton already talked about the fact that both members of that team have an equal responsibility to the work. Both people are responsible for the interpretation, making sure that things are clear and accurate, and all of those different aspects, which then means that we're working, both of us, the entire time, so that we have that equal responsibility and turn taking. So that's what you saw in that one slide, that both interpreters are accountable for the work that's being done. And that third part, you saw in that previous clip, that when there wasn't a hearing interpreter involved and there was just direct communication taking place between the deaf interpreter and the deaf consumer, it's just making sure that those needs are being met. But the primary support function is something that's critical if you have the deaf and hearing team. It's important to remember that perhaps for, say, in the voc rehab, say the resume class or the job interview, if you have the team in there and then making sure that the information is being presented appropriately, and then when there's more discussion taking place, interactions, and it could be a little more difficult to keep up with that and having to require further clarification as to who the primary interpreter or the support interpreter is at any one point, and that can change throughout the interaction. you're not stuck into one position or the other, that the CDI is going to do all of the signing and the hearing interpreter is going to do the voicing. You're both responsible for the entire work and assignment.
Right. And I think another example, again, it goes back to acculturation and that chart, that concept that we talked about earlier. A deaf person may be comfortable in any number of settings, in which case a hearing interpreter would suffice for the efficiency of that communication. But if they're reading legal documentation or signing legal documentation and there may be some uncertainty, they have full access through the interpreter to what's spoken, but when they look at textual information or printed information, the CDI would then become the primary interpreter in that setting and be doing text to sign interpretation and then allowing the hearing interpreter to go back into the primary role. And the CDI would then move into the secondary role, or support role, pardon me, interpreter error. And translating a document might warrant the CDI, they might not pay attention to what the hearing interpreter is interpreting any longer, or get a certain term clarified through the CDI. Again, the key is that there's flexibility to this role shifting, and we can use them creatively. My concern often is that there aren't enough deaf interpreters. If there's only one deaf interpreter on an all-day assignment, there isn't the possibility for true teamwork. If you have two hearing interpreters that are able to spell each other, and a deaf interpreter is the only person, that may require some flexibility in roles based upon the personnel that are there and the access that needs to be ensured throughout the day. So we often have to be very creative with the process and the roles that we use when we bring in a CDI. That they don't necessarily need to be or can be in the primary, signing role throughout an assignment.
And speaking of text, we've had Trenton involved with any of the text translations that need to be done in the voc rehab setting on the internet or the computer and so on. So I think we still have a class here in our state where the majority of the work is done via technology, and
food handling.
Like, for example, tests for food handlers. So we will have a deaf interpreter involved in that process to assist them in understanding the text. And perhaps you can share your experiences in working with that class.
Right. So there is a state contract with several interpreters who provide interpreting of the state food handler's exam, and they're able to give the directions and things. But again, that general interpretation doesn't necessarily suit the needs of a particular client. They may get the directions from the interpreter but miss a certain term and not understand it and give the wrong answer. But I come in and provide support for what they say watch on the video internet feed, and then I provide a richer and more detailed interpretation that suits the particular communication needs of that client. And so again, the hearing interpreter may need to be there, but could also be providing perhaps remote interpreting and utilizing a deaf interpreter on site, and that can either work from text, and that's really a strength of mine. I really like to work from text into sign language, or from a video and then clarify concepts presented in the video.
So again, we have to make sure we're thinking creatively and not be putting ourselves in a box as to what our functions are in these different settings. We need to make sure that we're able to have a variety of.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but also sometimes a hearing interpreter may not show up for an assignment, and we may think, oh well, that ends that. We have to wait to call another interpreter. But if I can get the information printed in text, then I can proceed from there. I know that wouldn't work for every situation. Some people might be saying, oh no, please don't proceed with just printed information. But that's another possibility that we've worked into certain settings.
And you may already be aware of this, but for the new novice interpreters who are just beginning to work with a deaf interpreter, they can really gain the strength that's provided by having a team. I've seen in a variety of settings that, well, if we're feeding to the interpreter and that chunk of information is something I'm extremely familiar with, then we might switch roles for that moment. And because the person who has the greater amount of experience and has that acculturation regarding those topics might be the one who takes on the lead role of that setting. But you know what, Trenton? Wow, our time has really gone by so quickly. I think we need to provide a little bit of time for questions, and then at the very end, we will be happy to answer any of your questions that you'd like to provide us in emails, or if you'd like us to give you further information, provide more slides and all that. We're very open for any last little questions.
Yes, and actually I do see one comment about the Department of Motor Vehicles. And here in Utah, we do utilize CDIs and hearing interpreter teams for translation of the written driving test. So that's, if you want to contact us particular to us giving you referral information about how that works here in Utah, perhaps we can help you coordinate that type of system where you are. But I know that we do take advantage of that here. That was one comment that I saw.
I think it is one of the tremendous benefits that if you're working with a voc rehab counselor, with DMV, and they are familiar with the success that takes place in providing those types of services, then it then leads to having a good opportunity to convince others to do likewise. Oftentimes, with the hearing interpreter, if they're struggling in making sure that they are conveying the need for having a CDI, we might give the CDI can give that information as to what their goals and values and how they can communicate with the deaf person more effectively, and help to not just convince people, but to make them have a change in their outlook. Because in those settings, especially in rehab, if you're going through job training or evaluation, it feels like you really do need to have a deaf interpreter so that it can then satisfy all the needs for the IPE, their work goals, and a variety of other aspects of the process. If the deaf person's worldview is given and stuff, that can make a great deal of difference and make that a very effective way to approach the idea of incorporating CDIs into the process.
Right. I know there are a number of ideas out there on how to incorporate the use of CDIs, and this is obviously focused on voc rehab settings, but in terms of college settings, post-secondary settings, mainstream settings, I think really the thing that prevents us from doing that, I mean, there are a small number of interpreters, of deaf interpreters in particular. We need more training. We need more certified deaf interpreters, and again, it always is based upon the need, the demand. Once the demand increases, and I'm imagining the supply will balance out. Right now, we have more deaf interpreters in terms of supply than demand, which is unfortunate, and that there's a number of factors that result in that. But when it comes to training, we do need more training for deaf interpreters and how to gain effective interpreting strategies. I noticed that there has been some frustration with just bringing in a CDI, and then if it doesn't work out all that well, people say, well, that wasn't worth it in the end. When in fact it could have worked out, but it wasn't necessarily the most qualified or most experienced interpreter who didn't have enough experience to be in that setting. So again, it can be effective based upon the support that we provide to interpreters to be in the right setting with the right skills.
I wanted to bring up one question that I saw, that how do we increase the feeling of trust and confidence in the whole interpretation process by using a CDI? And I can see that perhaps sometimes what makes it difficult to gain the confidence and trust is that not being able to explain the value of using the CDI. I know oftentimes hearing interpreters will feel that they have the credentials, but if they recognize the CDIs as having the same credentials, a greater use of language, like say if you're having a person who is learning Spanish and becomes fluent in that language, but compared to a family who is a native Spanish-speaking user from Spain or Mexico, oftentimes people will be able to make a better correlation between that particular setting and how we would like to see that happening in our world here. And the work is how we convey the need to the hearing people involved and access. And I'm not talking about interpreting per se, but explaining what happens during the process to convince them that there is a need and that they can feel comfortable about providing that particular service, because you have to build that confidence and provide continual check-in and make sure that there is that relationship between the deaf interpreter and the hearing consumers and stuff, so that they can carry on a conversation and build a relationship between the two of them, not just having it be between the two hearing persons involved in the interaction. So developing that sense of confidence and trust.
Well, I want to thank all of you. Despite all the questions that remain in the chat function, I wish we could go on and on, but thank you all for attending tonight's webinar. I hope that you gathered some rich information to develop the use of CDIs in your locations.
And thank you, Carrie, and the interpreters. You've been an awesome group.
Thank you guys for another marvelous webinar. Right now, the link for the survey has been put in the chat function, and it will also be sent you tomorrow in an email. It includes an evaluation survey, and it includes a CEU survey and a request for certificate survey. First of all, I'd like to thank Trenton and Jennifer for an amazing evening. Also to our interpreters, Kirk and Darlene, and our captionist, Terry. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty for CEUs. For the individual viewers, the survey was put into the chat box, as well as will be sent to you tomorrow, as I already said. The survey includes the evaluation and CEU questions. Please forward the survey to individuals if there's a group, so that everyone has a chance to fill it out. Registration forms must match up with the list of attendees, but really, as you log in, I have a record of the time that you were in the webinar, and I will match that to the CEU requests. For group visitor or group viewers, there was a sign-in sheet that was sent out today attached to the email. You need to have everyone sign in the group and then have the leader of the group email that back to me. Please have everyone fill out the survey. Please make sure that your name matches, especially your last name, matches your RID membership exactly. This is especially important for those with two last names that are hyphenated, if it has a space, those kinds of issues. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email me at carrie.woodruff@unco.edu. It can take up to 8 weeks for the CEUs to be posted to your transcripts, and I will get certificates of completion for those who ask for it in about 2 weeks of the webinar. So I hope you guys will all be back next month. We have Trudy Schaefer as our presenter. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.